All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have this ransomware panel for you. My name is Chris Sachs. I am with the CAMI Board of Directors and also the CEO of ThinkStack. I'm going to moderate the panel today, and we have two great guests for you. First is Marcelle Lee, who's with Secureworks. She is the Director of Security Research. And then we have Zach Hill, who is the CTO at ThinkStack. So Zach and I work together. And I'm going to give each of them a moment to let us understand more about their background and their introduction, and then we'll get started. For today, I hope we can keep this conversational, and happy to have any questions from the audience. If you can put them in the chat, we will address those. So I'll turn it over first to Marcelle to introduce herself and give us a little background, and then we'll go to Zach.
Super, thanks, Chris. I appreciate the intro. As Chris mentioned, and my background shows, I'm with Secureworks. I'm not quite a director, but I appreciate that information.
Sure.
You can
well, you know, you do good security research, senior security researcher. So.
Yes, I am. And I am also the emerging threats lead, which means that I have to keep my finger on the pulse of pretty much all the new and interesting cybersecurity things that are happening in our client space, which is a big space. I also am an educator and a trainer in cybersecurity. I have a consulting company, Fractal Security Group, that I do that work through, and also a big community advocate, especially around educating users, and then also diversity in the industry. So I wear a few different hats, but ransomware is definitely one of my areas that I'm very interested in. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marcelle. We're excited to have you. And Zach, if you can just give us a quick intro, a little background on yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. I'm Zachary Hill. I am the CTO at ThinkStack. My background kind of grew up primarily on the network and virtualization side, and that evolved into cloud and security over the last 5 to 6 years. Ultimately, I'm just very passionate about technology. I'm very intrigued and interested in all things technology, and spend a lot of my time, free time and otherwise, both working, tinkering, and evolving technology.
Awesome. Well, thanks. So 2020 has been an interesting year for a lot of reasons. But if you live in the Maryland area, just in the last 7 days, I think you've probably heard more about ransomware than maybe you've ever heard in a long time. So between GBMC, Baltimore County Schools, obviously Baltimore City last year, and then just one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the whole world got hit with ransomware. So ransomware is in the media, it's top of mind. And before we dive into ransomware, I would love each of you to kind of just give us your perspective on what is ransomware and how are you seeing it manifest in your individual industries? What do you think the threat level is on ransomware, and how might that compare to some of the other cybersecurity threats that you're seeing? So Marcelle, I'll start with you. Can you give us your take on what ransomware is?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the fundamental basic definition of ransomware is a threat actor gets into your environment, encrypts all your files, and then basically holds them hostage for a ransom payment. So that's, the sort of prototypical version. But the activity that I'm really more worried about right now is this new concept of naming and shaming. So it's like a double extortion scheme, essentially, where the threat actors get into your network. Well, that's kind of the same, right? But before they encrypt all your files, they actually exfiltrate them and then hold that data hostage, as well as then encrypting and forcing you to pay up either to get the decryption key or to get your files released. And the files are typically shared on what's called a leak site, and the different ransomware families have their own leak sites where they will list their victims, and if the victims don't pay up, they will release their data. So it could be as simple as like a link to a Dropbox share, and you can get access to a company's private data. So that's top of mind for me. It's something that's really only been happening for like the past year or so, but a lot of families are jumping on the bandwagon, and it's has so many like deeper implications other than just the encryption piece.
Awesome, thanks. And Zach, you know, I don't know how many folks here have heard of or dealt with ransomware. I think Marcelle gave us a good idea. Do you have anything to add around what ransomware is, how it can be impactful inside of a business?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Marcelle put it really succinctly with, you know, what the modern tactics are, and the end result being many weeks or months of really of either downtime for an organization or a steep legal battle, you know, oftentimes with things like compliance and auditors and all that, just to come back from an event of this. It's certainly a nightmare for organizations to go through when, you know, there's some fairly simple controls that can be put in place to help protect from these types of things. But I think the modern you know, approach to it has been something that's been very detrimental to organizations across the world.
So Zach, can you speak to that a little bit more? You know, I think a lot of times when people read about ransomware, they see the impact of perhaps data loss. And I know at ThinkStack, we've been part of some incident response just this year, and maybe speaking to the broader level of impact that it can have on a business that most people probably don't think about or understand, how it can shut down operations, and how this idea of encrypting your network and locking you out of your network can have real impact to your business, to your employees, to your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, at patient zero, you know, the first day, the first opportunity that it happens is really when the clock starts ticking. I think a lot of organizations probably don't understand that, you know, the very first thing that's going to happen ultimately is your employees, your users, your members, your clients. You're going to lose access to a lot of your applications, to a lot of your data. And for different organizations, that can mean different things. It can mean quite literally losing everything and access to everything, or it can mean losing subsets of your environment. And that starts a recovery process, which, depending on how you know, evolved your IT is and your security procedures are, it can last for many weeks of recovery. Certainly, we have seen, you know, recovery last for many months as well, of kind of getting back to what normal looks like, just from a technical perspective. I think the other component that really goes into that is that business aspect, and a lot of times, you know, depending on the organization, that can be things like legal battles, you know, around, you know, the data that was leaked or that was sent out of the network. It can evolve around, you know, having to deal with different firms like IR firms, incident response firms, or forensics firms who need to come in and understand what had occurred. It can also really have a lasting impression on, you know, what the organization has to do. You know, this year and last year and through some of the incident responses that our team has been a part of, it's something where the business needs to consider, you know, what data was leaked and or potentially leaked, and having controls around that. For example, you know, if your books, so to speak, you know, if your financial data and your HR data was leaked, then, you know, it's things like having credit protections in place for your employees, which has a cost to it, and it's things like making sure that the vendors that you work with, perhaps, or other organizations that you work with, might also have implications around what that data being encrypted or leaked may have. It could be conversations with them around some payments that need to occur, or it could be as simple as kind of shoring up and locking things down further. So ransomware is certainly not tends to not be an event that happens on day one, and by day 7 you're kind of walking free and clear. As Marcelle pointed out, the more modern approach has very lasting effects on an organization.
Thanks. Yeah, and Marcelle, in your roles, can you share a little bit about the business impact that you have seen during ransomware, and any data or relevancy there, stories that you're allowed to share?
Yeah,
anonymously, of course.
Right. So there's a couple of things that I think are important for folks to understand. And one of those is that anybody is potentially a target for ransomware, right? I've heard many people say, oh, why would my organization be targeted? It's a small company, or it's a farm, or whatever. And it doesn't matter. It's can be targeted, but ransomware can also be just a crime of opportunity. Threat actors will go after whoever might have some money to pay them. So if you've got some money, then you are a possible candidate. And maybe not just, well, I guess money's the main thing because that's how they're motivated. But maybe they're after some other, secret, I don't know, recipe for chicken fillets or something. So that's one thing that I always try to impress upon people. But yeah, the implications are far-reaching, and especially with this, data leakage aspect of it, and Zach kind of touched on this already, but you get into all kinds of areas of compliance issues. If you're in payment processing, you've got PCI to comply with, medical, you've got HIPAA, there's all these different privacy legislations out there that might be an issue for you. Also, if you're doing any business, overseas, then GDPR comes into play. You got to worry about, that kind of data leakage. And it's really a mess, and it's hard to extricate, yourself out of it, because there's legal, there's, the financial impact, of course, there's your organization's reputation is a huge part of it. My heart goes out to the folks at FireEye right now, because that's like the worst thing that could happen to a security company, and it could happen to any of us, right? Nobody is immune. So there's far-reaching implications, and I probably do have some stories that I can share, but we'll get into those in perhaps a little bit.
Understood. Yeah, I think one of the points I wanted to drive home with that, as well, as we had an organization that was in an industry that you probably wouldn't typically associate with this. Like, a lot of times we think financial institutions, healthcare, government agencies, but we've had some organizations in the past couple of years that are in construction, that are in various different industries, get hit with ransomware, and they didn't recognize themselves as a target. Part of that is low-hanging fruit, thinking that some of these industries aren't taking cybersecurity perhaps as seriously as some of the others. So you open yourself up to become a target because there is a lack of investment in cybersecurity and a lack of regulations. The hackers are actually looking at that as a targeted market. And then on the flip side, again, it goes back to what is that business impact? So we had an organization that didn't recognize this going in, but all of their trucks were fueled on a network-based fuel system, and that network-based fuel system was down. And so all of a sudden, you don't think, hey, this is a technology thing, my tech systems are down, but we can still do what we need to do. And the reality was they couldn't even operate their business because some of these systems are connected to technology in ways that that we often forget. We've had some in healthcare with impact on writing prescriptions. So simple things can really be impacted when you lose that. So having an understanding in your business of what systems could be impacted, what business processes can be impacted, is important. So Marcelle, it seems like from a a media perspective, if you're a non-cybersecurity professional, it would seem like ransomware is picking up in popularity. Is that true? Are there other trends that we're seeing in cybersecurity? Are there other attacks? Or do you feel like this is one of the most common? Where does ransomware rank among all the cyber threats that exist?
Yeah, so ransomware is pretty prevalent, and at Secureworks we have a very robust incident response practice, and we do like a quarterly roll up of all the engagements and just what we've seen, and I actually just finished up like the one for the third quarter. So I can tell you that financially motivated crimes are definitely the majority of what we're seeing, and as a subset of that, ransomware leads the pack. But other things that I've been observing lately is a trend of delivery of loaders. There's some new loaders on the scene. Bureau loader is one that comes to mind. Bazaar loader, Z loader is not new, but there seems to be an uptick in that kind of activity. And a loader is really, it's just a piece of malware that downloads other malware. So it could download anything, right? It could download ransomware. But we're seeing these loaders used in conjunction with the ransomware delivery. And we're also seeing, various botnets engaged in delivering ransomware now too. So for example, I'm working on researching a ransomware family called egregor right now. And there's suggestion that Quackbot, which is a botnet, also known as Qbot, is delivering egregor. So the loaders, are interesting to watch too. And one of the things that is important to note in terms of like protecting yourself is that, we refer to all this typically as post-intrusion ransomware because the threat actors are already in your network. They've gotten in either by phishing, which, as the last speaker mentioned, is by far the most prevalent way of getting in, or by exploitation of like internet-facing devices. And we see a lot of that too. So like, for example, like the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability, that's a big one that gets exploited still all the time. Pulse VPN's another one. And this all ties into with, of course, so many people working remotely now, we have more of that kind of attack service available. But anyways, the threat actors get in, and there's a lot of activity that is pretty similar between engagements that's your opportunity to detect and hopefully eradicate before you get hit with the ransomware part. So it is preventable. And we could maybe talk a little bit more about the infection chain, but like the loaders is kind of part of that. That's where my train of thought was going.
Awesome, thanks. And Zach, kind of same question to you. What are you seeing is ransomware? Has that been the most prevalent? Other types of attacks that are out there? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. To add on to what Marcelle had to say, I think it is very prevalent today, and I think in a COVID world, it's certainly seen an uptick, as she mentioned, 2 remote access systems right there that have really hit the news, and there's a reason why it's been a hot topic is because frankly, a lot of organizations, both large and small, had to deal with quickly deploying a way to remotely work for their users, and frankly, people didn't spend the time nor the money on doing that in maybe the most sustainable way. And that has resulted on ransomware being very targeted, and phishing and spear phishing campaigns being very, very targeted. And I think that ultimately, the other thing to note, as Marcelle had mentioned, is it's very lucrative. A very popular group that you may have heard called NetWalker, I think reportedly is upward around like $30 million or something for the year, in terms of just what people have deduced that they've potentially made. And that's not even speaking of what they've potentially made on selling the data and things like that. So I think that ultimately ultimately and unfortunately, it's a very lucrative business for these organizations to use ransomware And not only is it very prevalent, but it has a proven track record of working, which is another problem that we're seeing today.
Thanks. Yeah. So I just want to take a minute. I see that we have Vince and we have Charlotte out there. Vince and Charlotte, I would love to welcome you both to just introduce yourselves if you'd like to. And then if you have any questions, I have a number of other questions that we can keep going with, but to the extent that we want to make this as valuable a presentation as we can, I just love to invite both of you. So Vince, I see you. If you just want to introduce yourself, and then Charlotte, if you can, that'd be great as well. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning. Don't want to scare anybody off with my video here, but I will let you look at my my little office here in my house. So good to see you all. Sam, I see you're on here. Good to see you. I recently joined the Maryland Department of Commerce back in September, the end of September. And I work in the Office of Strategic Industries and Entrepreneurship. And the two industries that I am responsible for in that office are cybersecurity and aerospace. So with all transparency, aerospace is more of my background than cyber, but trying to come up to speed fast. And this whole idea, this whole concept and problem of ransomware is really interesting to me. And well, it's really scary to me, but it's very interesting, especially being in government now, if bad actors get hold of thousands and tens of thousands of personal identifiable information or data sets that, you know, government and academia have, which are gigantic. So I just really am trying to learn what kind of resources that we have in the state of Maryland that you know, could coalesce around this problem. Because, you know, at Commerce, what we're trying to do is, we're not the technology leaders, but we want to understand what we've got here in the state, promote the talent that we have in the state, attract more talent to the state to try to solve these problems and work for companies like yours, the people on this call, and the kinds of programs or incentives, training, things that Commerce could try to promote and advocate for as we put budget, you know, help to see where budgets go for the state. You know, where we have to do what the legislature says, but that doesn't mean we can't try and influence and advocate for certain things. So I just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Vince. And Charlotte, are you out there?
Perhaps not.
No worries. Okay, so to continue with this line of questioning, I think you both mentioned this a bit, but I'd like to expand on it just to give people an understanding. And this is, could you speak to how COVID has changed or perhaps increased the threat landscape, and talk about what probably is going to look like the future of work no matter what, and how that could present future vulnerabilities. Excuse me. Marcelle, I will start with you.
Sure. So like we kind of touched on already, I think what we've seen with COVID and the advent of people working remotely in far greater numbers than they ever have done before is that increased attack surface, where there's people who are connecting remotely into their organizations. A lot of that infrastructure was set up in a hurry, right? Because it just had to be. And the associated vulnerabilities that are involved with that. So not only just, you know, patching your internet facing devices, making sure that the software is up to date and that kind of thing, that's one big piece of it. Another piece of it is using multi-factor authentication. That's like a huge thing. And oh my gosh, if everybody did that, it would really cause a lot of problems for the threat actors. But unfortunately, people don't often do that. But yeah, so the attack surface has increased. And we definitely saw, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of activity around phishing using COVID as a lure, right? And pretty much anything that's popular in the news or in the world in general is going to be used as a lure. So, I mean, on the one hand, it almost made it easier for like user education or awareness, because it's like, basically, if you get anything in an email about COVID, like, be leery of it. So it's kind of nice when it all like comes down to just like one topic instead of like many different ones. But yeah, so I think generally what we saw was not an increase in like phishing activity in general, but just a big like like swerve to using that particular lure.
And Zach, I'll throw this one at you, but I think Marcelle brought up a really interesting point when she was explaining that. And it seems like the biggest barrier that we have to effective cybersecurity is inconvenience, meaning wouldn't it be so nice if everybody used two-factor authentication? And really, what is the reason that we're not? And it is typically human experience. What types of conversations do you have with business leaders to help them understand? I'm chuckling because there was an incident this week with a lack of two-factor authentication, despite begging to do that for about a year. But what do those conversations look like? With with an executive leadership team, and what are some thoughts that you could give to business leaders out there who are always balancing productivity and efficiency with cybersecurity? What could that look like, and what advice could you give to them about making sure you're as secure as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the conversations that I have, particularly this year, are just mainly around, kind of the baseline has really, the bar of the baseline has really changed. It's been changing over time for a long time, but as you had alluded to, and as Marcelle had mentioned, it's something that people aren't doing or haven't been doing due to efficiency or due to not wanting to disrupt their employees or their workflow or whatever it may be. And now with so much of a spotlight on cybersecurity, frankly, this year than it has ever been before, it's time for everyone to kind of step up and really just swallow that pill of changes do have to be made to the way people do things and the way that things are set up. And frankly, a lot of organizations out there that host platforms, I'm thinking of Microsoft with Office 365. I'm thinking of, everyone from Slack to, the Teams to AWS to Google to whomever else. They've all put forth the time, energy, and effort, really in the last few years more than ever, to make it more obtainable and to make it easier for organizations to leverage. As an example, a year ago today, this didn't exist, but within Office 365, for those of you who might be using that platform for communication or for file sharing and things like that, there didn't exist a quick little checkbox, for example, to enforce multi-factor authentication across the board, whereas today, that feature does exist. Before it certainly existed, but it wasn't a checkbox. It was a little bit more involved. There was, a handful of checkboxes. And so I think ultimately the conversations I'm having with people surround, leveraging the tools that you have, taking a hard look at am I set up in a way that's secure, or the way that my users or my employees or my clients are accessing the systems that I have to offer, is that as secure as it can be, and am I at least meeting the new baseline, and that new baseline being enforcing things like multi-factor authentication, and I'm sure some of the things we'll get into a little bit later. So I think that's a lot of the conversation, and pointing out the other organizations who have done it wrong, right? Pointing out the news articles and saying like this can happen to you. There are more bad actors now than there ever have been, and we're at a point where it's just as likely that you get hit as someone else gets hit. So that's a lot of the conversation that certainly that I've been having.
Awesome, thanks. And to that point, I'm sure what everybody wants to know. So Marcelle, how do organizations start to reduce the risk of ransomware? I think it's important to say that there is no way short of unplugging the internet and doing nothing via technology to truly be to prevent all cyber attacks. That's not a place that you can get your organization to. But what are the biggest steps that organizations can take to prevent and mitigate the risk of ransomware and other cyber attacks?
Yeah, so this is definitely where we get into the convenience part of things. Cutting off the internet altogether probably is not a viable solution for anybody. And really it's like the top 10 type recommendations that I see over and over again that are given to our clients in the different engagements are multi-factor, which we've already talked about, patching, updates. Like none of this is super hard, like technology or anything really special to do, but it does require diligence. It requires having a team of people who are capable of doing these things. And that I think is sometimes the hard part, but just being aware of what's happening in your environment and like I said before, detecting that potential infection chain before it leads to something worse like ransomware. That's how you're gonna best decrease your chances of getting hit with ransomware or really anything else for that matter. And I just wanted to go back to like the credential part for a minute too, because that's one of the things we see in almost every engagement, right? As soon as a threat actor gains access to an environment, which is not that hard to do. Like it's nobody has like a impenetrable network. We all have holes in our networks. It's just how it is. But once an attacker gets in, the first thing they're going to do are dump user credentials, which then once they have those, it's like kind of like the keys to the kingdom. They can get back in anytime they want to. They can use those credentials in other places and see if they work. So that's where that multi-factor comes into play, because if you have that, where the attacker will try to log in, but then they'll be stymied by that additional step, hopefully. So I could like talk about how important that is all day long, and it's really one of the most like number one recommendation all the time. But then other things that we look at, and this is not so much preventative, but it's more on the detective side of things, is looking at your logging. A dearth of logs is always an issue with investigations, because it's really hard to tell like what the attacker may have done in your network when you don't have logs for more than like a few days or something like that. So logging is often a recommendation. Setting up Outlook rules is another one, and this one's more related to like say business email compromise and that sort of thing, but like not allowing auto forwarding, because sometimes threat actors will get into an Outlook account and set up rules to like auto forward all the email to their own account and that kind of thing. So different security things around like mail or Office 365 are also recommendations that we frequently make. Those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Marcelle. And I think, Zach, I'll throw this to you on the recommendation side. But I think what's interesting, and I know as I've listened to talk radio about, the GVMC and Baltimore County schools recently, the conversation often jumps to budget and these advanced cybersecurity tools that these organizations can't afford and haven't appropriately budgeted for. And I'm struck by that because, just the list that you gave us, Marcelle, and Zach, I think what you'll say is there seems to be a lot of things that organizations can do that are what I would say are more fundamental than buying these big fancy cybersecurity monitoring tools, and can prevent and eliminate a lot of the risk that an organization may have by simply doing the things that are often free and or using the tools that you already have at your disposal correctly. So Zach, could you talk about that a little bit? What are some of the recommendations? What are those fundamentals that organizations should be doing that don't necessarily cost a whole bunch of money, but can really reduce the threat exposure?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think, I think the way Marcelle put it was really apt with there are a lot of low-hanging fruit to accomplish with what you have today. And I think probably the first place to start is in policy and procedure, frankly. I think a lot of things can be done that are not sexy. Like none of the things we're talking about today are super sexy topics. We're not talking about involving some AI or machine learning based tool that's looking at the logs that Marcella was talking about and trying to look for those actors. Like, yes, there's a whole world of that out there. But frankly, the attackers, unless you're receiving a very targeted attack, the attackers are looking at attacks of opportunities, particularly in the spaces that we're kind of talking about today. And I think it's doing a lot of the unsexy things. It's like you mentioned, it's the patching. It's actually reviewing your footprint. Like what is your footprint look like to the outside world, right? Some of those things might be like what's known as an external vulnerability scan or a pen test, which certainly does have a cost to it, but frankly, is certainly going to be less of a cost than recovering from a ransomware event. And again, it's going back to that policy and procedure. What do you have in place for security in general? If something does happen, how are you responding to it? Do you have something in place? Do you have a team of people that you can reach out to? Do you have an IT vendor, a security vendor, a forensics vendor, or what's known as an IR vendor? Those are some of the things that can be done with little to no cost, as well as just like reviewing your tools and systems and making sure up to date. The footprint is as small as it can be from the outside, and doing the things like Marcella mentioned, like the patching, the backups, the multi-factor. Those are all things that can be done with such a minimal cost that will almost certainly, if not stop or prevent the ransomware from happening, at the very least, it will reduce the impact it has, or perhaps even the point of the breach, and the amount of things impacted. The thing I tell people all the time is doing things like network segmentation, like segmenting out the systems that you have away from each other. Something that I see all the time is people do a lot of the right things. They'll have backups, they'll have antivirus, they'll have multi-factor and all these things, but they won't take the time and make sure one simple step. Are your backups accessible from the network? Are they accessible using the same credentials that you use today? Are they accessible over the same communication paths that the rest of your network is? That's one that bites people in the butt a lot, frankly, of when a ransomware event gets in and they encrypt your data, but then they also encrypt your backups, which you were planning on recovering from. I think doing a lot of those things and participating in those low-hanging fruit, the non-sexy things, does a lot for an organization to be protected.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And so with the last couple minutes that we have, I know Marcelle and Zach, you guys are not agriculture experts, but rather cybersecurity experts. But could you give some thought and perhaps let the audience know how this ransomware event could potentially impact and intersect with the agriculture industry?
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about that, since this event first came up, and I did actually grow up on the eastern shore of Maryland, so I'm kind of familiar with like the territory over there, and I think of things like, if you're a farmer with livestock, like a chicken farmer or something, ransomware could lock up the systems that, are taking care of the chickens, feeding them and watering them and all that kind of thing. And then you might end up with 100,000 dead chickens or something to that effect. So that's the thing, I think, and I think you touched on this earlier, Chris, that people sometimes miss is it's that there's all different kinds of systems that can be impacted. It's not just like files on your, desktop computer. It spreads throughout anything that's connected to that network. And like, just for example, most people who get hit with ransomware, most organizations, like their website goes down because their web server gets hit as well. So it really is much more extensive, I think, than people realize. So that's what I would think. But this is across the board for any organization or industry. So yeah, that was my thought. Zach, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think something you said earlier, Marcelle, was really poignant too, related to how prevalent it is at all sizes of an organization, right? It could be a single individual all the way up to a multi-billion-dollar organization. And in fact, we only really hear about the big ones because that's what makes the news. But frankly, as I know we're seeing it across the board, and I think as you had mentioned, it's the fact that there's all these other systems. We live in a very modern world, and I think unless you're quite literally working on like an Amish farm, you're probably interconnected in some way. You're probably using IoT-based devices. Maybe you're using it for your irrigation. Maybe you're using it for your feed systems. Maybe you're using it for just your projections related to what you're going to sell or when you're going to sell. Various things. I think even if you're just using it for budgeting, frankly, that can have an impact on people. And certainly today's modern world is so connected that the impact is hard to uncover until you frankly, until the EMP bomb goes off, right? Until the things are shut down and you don't know what you don't know. So I certainly urge people to take the time and the energy and the effort in reviewing that today.
And I agree with you 100% on that. And one thing I want to mention is Cybersecurity Association of Maryland, CAMI, which we're involved with at various levels, is a great resource for people to identify vendors. We also have a cyber SWAT line. So if you have a cyber emergency, you can contact CAMI and thanks, Sam, for the link. Somebody will help you out with that. So there definitely are resources out there. You're not in this alone. And Vince had asked about, how do we warn employees? And I mean, we always say educate users is another one of the top recommendations, but how do you really effectively do that? I think that trying to invest in some meaningful awareness training is key, and meaningful is complicated, right? But there's definitely companies out there that do that sort of thing, and making it relatable to your employees. Like it's not just going to impact the company, but get them to recognize these things in their own personal life as well. It's like you too, like you said before, like I could be hit with ransomware. I might actually care more about that. Like if I lose like my kid pictures or something, then I would be thinking about the company. But if you kind of make it relevant, across the board that way, then it just gets people into more of a security mindset. So that's one technique that I recommend.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. I think this was an informative conversation, and as Marcelle mentioned, CAMI does have a number of resources. So hopefully, if you take anything away from this, it's that we need to take these threats more and more seriously. They're having a greater impact to our business. There are ways to prevent them, and there are plenty of resources out there to help you. So just want to thank everybody for their time, and appreciate Zach and Marcelle joining us.